be ending up a study sheet that says God makes allowances for extenuating circumstances. And we saw where God made allowances for people in the Old Testament that could not keep the Passover feast on the day that he had commanded. And we won't go into that again, but those scriptures are there if you want to look at those past tense. But God, even though he commanded the Passover feast to be a certain day of the month, a certain year and all that, time of year, he did make allowances for people that couldn't, for some reason beyond their control, not be able to celebrate the Passover on time. So this morning, we're going to be in the New Testament. This is Mark chapter 3, the Gospel of Mark chapter 3. And we're dealing with Jesus. Did he ever make allowances for extenuating circumstances that were sort of out of people's control? And last week we ended up looking at the last part of Mark chapter 2, the last three paragraphs of Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through the end of the chapter of Mark 2. Jesus was caught in a trap by these good, righteous Pharisees that were the rules police of all the ins and outs of meticulous rules that they had prescribed for the Sabbath day. Of course, Sabbath was our Saturday, but that was their true holy day. And you may remember that one of the 10 Commandments was very clear. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor, do your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You don't do any work, neither your son or daughter, your servants, or anybody. You don't do any work. For God said he made the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and then he rested on the seventh day. And therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Their idea of the Sabbath was pretty clear. You don't do any work on it. And at this time of day, this time of year, Jesus and his disciples were walking, taking a journey on the Sabbath to some degree. They didn't have anything to eat, so they stopped by a field of grain, probably wheat or barley, and got heads, rubbed it together, got enough grain to eat to satisfy their hunger as they went. And this is perfectly legal with the Old Testament law. God says if you're on a journey and you need to eat what you need to out of your neighbor's field, but you just don't harvest any and put it in your pockets. You just take what you need and go on. And yet here were these Pharisees that were so threatened by Jesus' authority, so threatened by Jesus' popularity among the common folks, that they were watching him. And sure enough, he ate on the Sabbath. And they accused him of doing work. And Jesus says, "No, I am Lord of the Sabbath. I am over the Sabbath more than you guys." And then he made this little statement: the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Meaning, God made the Sabbath as a blessing to us, not a burden. And what he meant by that is this: God just said, keep the Sabbath holy. And these guys were so in tune with making rules that through the centuries they had defined about 460 some odd rules on what it was that you could and could not do on the Sabbath. Not supposed to take a long journey on the Sabbath, so they had counted out how many steps you could take without getting in trouble. And we know we had to cook our meal for Sunday, for the Sabbath. You can gather enough sticks to start your fire, to bake your bread or whatever, But if you gather too many sticks over that number, then you're in trouble, because that's work. You can't work on the Sabbath. This was the kind of minute rules that they had, nitpicking rules about what you could and could not do on the Sabbath. These were not from the Lord. These were from these legalistic, Pharisaical Jews. And Jesus says, look, the Sabbath is to be man's blessing. The Sabbath was made to bless us, not to be our burden. In other words, you can think of all your rules, but following these rules will not bring you closer to God if you don't look at the blessings of God. Focusing on rules is one thing, and we can do those all day long and do them perfectly, and not even give God a nod if we don't realize that the goal of this rule keeping is to keep the Sabbath holy. And they had a real struggle with that. Keep the laws. But as we know, that was their burden. Oh my goodness, tomorrow's a Saturday. Tomorrow's a Sabbath. All right. I better be careful to get this done now and get this and this, so I won't get in trouble tomorrow if I do extra things that they would call work and I'd get in trouble. And Jesus was saying the Sabbath is a blessing, not a burden. And he says we need to eat, and we did. Now, Jesus has another example right here in the first few verses of chapter 3 that we're going to read and see what happens. And again, the Pharisees are trying to catch Jesus doing something against their Sabbath laws. Let me read the first 6 verses of Mark chapter 3. Another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and there a man with a shriveled or withered hand was there. And some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, or to save life or to kill?" They remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, hardness of their hearts, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Let's look at this. Now, we know that the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, sometimes recorded the same incident, a little bit different viewpoint, a little bit different angle. And sure enough, Matthew has a duplicate discussion on this little incident. And it implies that this healing of the man with the withered hand happened just right after this incident with the grain fields. It happened just pretty quickly. Jesus was in their church, called the synagogue at that time for the Jewish people. It says that the Jews were trying to hide in the bushes and try to find something wrong with Jesus so they could get rid of him. And they were really watching Jesus to see if what? He would steal on the Sabbath or profane on the Sabbath? No, if he would heal on the Sabbath. Because that would be work. That's too much work on the Sabbath to heal a withered man's hand. And if we could catch him doing that, then we got him. That was their mentality, if you can believe that. So Jesus calls the man up front and center, stand up. And then Jesus turns to the Pharisees and asks them this question, which is lawful to do on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil? Evil, to save life or to kill. And of course that doesn't need an answer, because the answer is obvious. You do good on the Sabbath. You help and you heal and you care for on the Sabbath, of course. They didn't answer. They were smart enough to know that he'd probably trap us if we answered the question, so we'll just remain silent. So they did. And it says Jesus looked at them in just anger and despondency at the hardness of their hearts, at their priorities, that following little rules was more important than healing a man on the Sabbath. Can you imagine their priorities? That rule keeping, nitpicking rules, they considered more important than doing the blessing of healing this man's hand. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed, anguishing at their stubborn, hard hearts. So he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And his hand was completely healed. And you know that the whole room collectively gasped when they saw it. And then the buzz started. Did you see that? Who is this man? Is he really the Son of God? Is he the Messiah? And then all of us would be thinking about, oh yes, I have a distant cousin that has a weak leg. Maybe we could get Jesus over there. Maybe my sister and my brother and I'm sure they connected the dots real quickly, but this man can heal. What wonder, what blessing. But what did the Pharisees do? They began to plot to kill Jesus. This was their priorities. Can you imagine this? That they would rather kill the man than let him, quote, profane the Sabbath by healing a man with a withered hand. That was their priorities. That was how perverted, that was how upside down these Jewish leaders were. And of course we know that's what eventually put Jesus on the cross, was their willingness and their hardness of hearts to see him as the Messiah. And can you just imagine this? Now in the parallel passage in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew records that Jesus says, okay, now, which of you, if you have a sheep that falls into a pit on the Sabbath, is not going to reach down and pull it out? And of course, again, doesn't need an answer. That question doesn't need an answer. Of course, everybody would. And then he says, isn't mankind worth more than a sheep? And of course, that answer is, of course. Yes, people are more important than animals. And so, yet here they say, this man worked on the Sabbath. We need to not just shut him up, we need to kill him. This is the ultimate result of law keeping at its best. This is ultimate law keeping at its best. The failure to see the big picture. Now, yes, be a good Jew. I'll try not to do work on the Sabbath. I won't harvest. I won't gather too many extra sticks and all that. I will do all that. Yes, I'll do my best. But that's not the goal. The big picture is to honor God by keeping the Sabbath holy. And yet if you just look at the rules, and they were masters at this was the ultimate result of keeping the rules, shutting out God. This was serious. This was serious when we see how upside down this was. So when we think about anything that God asks us to do, and oh yes, God wants us to live holy lives. Yes, we follow God's commands. But it's not to check the box, do this, do that, but it's somehow to honor God. Be ye holy because I'm holy. God said over and over and over in the Old Testament, I want you to live a holy life because I'm holy. And that's our goal. Not to count the numbers, but to follow God. So Jesus teaches us two things here about the Sabbath that it's okay to do. One, works of necessity. All right? If you got to eat on the Sabbath, that's a necessity. We got to do it, and that's okay. There are people that have jobs that have to continue on a Sunday. Our doctors and nurses at the hospital, they have to be on duty on Sunday. That's works of necessity. We have people in prison out here, and they don't take off and act nice on Sunday without any supervision, so our prison guards have to work on Sunday. There are people that have to do works of necessity. And that's what Jesus was saying, eating on the Sabbath. You can do that. Also, works of mercy. This healing of the blind man, the man with the withered hand on Sunday, on the Sabbath for them. Works of compassion, yes. And that's okay. That's part of it. And so we realize that our focus must be not on the rules, but on the results. We have to see the big picture. We have to see what God is asking us to do. And we always say, Lord, whatever I do, word or deed, we do all in the name of the Lord. All right, let me pause there just for a minute. Any comment or question on Jesus making an exception here for an extenuating circumstance and saying it's okay? Is there a comment or question on this? All right, I'm going to say something here. At the top of our sheet, our handout sheet, it says the nature of God. That's our series, right? The nature of God. And our big question, as we've talked about, what is God like? Well, He's loving. He's patient. He's kind. He's all-knowing. He's all-powerful. And on we could go. I'm going to add one to that with all trepidation. God is reasonable. God is reasonable, meaning God knows our plight. God knows we have feet of clay. God knows we're sinners. And He never asks the impossible of us because He has, quote, been in our shoes. And as Jesus would say, oh, you little faith, don't you know that God knows the number of hairs on your head? Don't you know God knows every sparrow that falls? Don't you know He knows you and cares about you more than you even know about? And of course the answer is, of course. God is reasonable. And let us never think that following God is a burden that I've got to shoulder up and bear under, and I got to do everything just right, or God's going to burn me. God is reasonable. He wants to help us. He wants to show us His glory and to give us His blessings. And let's remember that, okay? Now, got time for two more scriptures about our view of the Sabbath. And again, we all know this, but let me remind you. The Sabbath day is no longer, part of the new covenant with Christ. Yes, we worship on Sunday because Sunday is the day of the resurrection. It took a little while in the first century for people to, quit worshiping on Saturday and go to Sunday, those that became Christian. And so we don't have these little nitpicking laws, thank goodness, about what we do on Sunday. But yes, we set aside in some way time for rest, time for worship on Sunday. But let's see, there's a couple of verses. One, I'm going to go back to the Old Testament, and that's on your sheet there from the book of Isaiah. And we think, well, okay, yes, we know that everybody in the Old Testament was burdened with this law-keeping thing, nitpicking rules. But really, was that God's goal in all of this to begin with? And let me read here from Isaiah chapter 58. Now, this was a prophet. He was speaking God's word. And sometimes prophets use very symbolic or poetic language. But this is God's ideal, even back in the Old Testament days. This is Isaiah 58, beginning with verse 13. Isaiah says to the Jewish people, he says, "Now if you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath, and from doing as you please on my holy day, and if you call the Sabbath a delight, and the Lord's day, holy day, honorable, and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way, and not doing as you please, or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land, and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob," which was Israel. "For the mouth of the Lord has spoken." All right. I didn't find too many rules here in this big picture view of the Sabbath. God's blessing for the Sabbath. He just says, if you don't just run willy-nilly and do as you please on the Sabbath and satisfy your own desires, and if you call the Sabbath something that's good and a delight, and you honor it and all that, and you honor the Sabbath by not just fulfilling your own wishes, but recognizing that this is for the Lord, then he says you're going to find joy in the Lord, and you're going to have blessings. Symbolic blessings here, but yes, this was their benefit. The Sabbath was not the burden. The Sabbath was the benefit, the blessing of God. And bless their hearts, try as they might, they couldn't keep the law, which of course we knew God, one part of God's plan is to show us that we cannot keep all the rules. But yet, even originally, God's design for the blessing of the Sabbath was very well known. All right, we're going to flip over now to the New Testament and finish up. There's a passage here about worship in the New Testament day. And this is from Hebrews chapter 10. And I bet you I'm going to quote a little scripture that we have all heard in the past. "Forsake not the assembling of yourselves together as the manner of some is." We may have heard that through the past, in the past, as a very stern admonition. It says right here in Hebrews 10:25, you better go to church. You better not forsake the assembling of together as the manner of some is. And that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And some of us took that as more of a directive of beating us over the head to say, you better be in church on Sunday. But let's look at this, and this is a very simple rule of Scripture, is you look at the context, meaning what goes before it and what comes after it. These little verses were not just sent out blip, 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 but it's part of a letter, it's part of a discussion, it's part of a narrative, it's part of a bigger whole. So we say, you got to look at the context, the ins and outs, and who it's for and what they're talking about. So let's look at this for a moment. He's in the little few verses prior to this. The writer of this book of Hebrews says, you know, we're now able to come to God in a very special way. He says, we have come able to, as it's called in the Old Testament way, the most holy place, the most inner sanctum, holy place in the temple. We're able now to approach God like that through Jesus, through His Son. And Jesus is our great high priest now. And we can come before God with a sincere heart and the full assurance that faith brings to us. We're now washed, we're clean, and we have this unfailing, unwavering, unswerving hope that we profess. And how do we know it's unfailing? Our hope is unfailing is because He who promised to give these things is faithful. God is faithful. And there's no doubt, the writer says, that we have this unfailing hope through the fullness of God, faithfulness of God. And then he says in verse 24, this is the key. Now, because of all this, how do we share our lives together? How do we urge everyone on, spur everyone on, one another, towards love and the good deeds? He says, but not giving up meeting together. Don't quit meeting together. If you want to encourage one another in the Christian walk, don't forsake the assembling of togetherness. And he says some of us are in the habit of doing that. And he said that's not good. But he says we need to encourage one another, and all much more as you see the day approaching. The writer says, coming together, yes, for worship. We worship God, but part of it is encouraging us in our walk, in our faithfulness, in our love, in our serving of others, love and our good works. And he says, you need to do that. Don't think you can all by yourself, out alone. And that's intentional. That's my word this morning. Intend. We know what it means to intend. See, all of us that are here this morning got up and intended to come to church. It was something we desired to do, and we got it accomplished. This is intentional. Both in Old and New Testament, I see the idea that the Sabbath or Sunday is God's rest to us. It's intentional. Our Sabbaths must be intentional, but it's not rule keeping. Yes, we need to think about it and do it in an intentional way, but not looking at the rules, looking at why we're here. Let's see, did I wake up this morning and think, okay, that's right, the verse in my head is forsake not the assembling, so I better get up and get dressed and go so I won't fail that command. That was not my motive. My intention was to come and be together with you, to discuss, to grow, be together, but most importantly, to to worship in just a few minutes. Our Sabbaths are to be intentional, but not rule-keeping. So that's our thoughts this morning, is that God has a big picture for us, and let us never fail to see that as we look at His nature. Let me pause there. Any thought or comment or question on that? We talked last week, and Jay brought it up, how our Sundays have changed culturally in our lifetimes, and we have to deal with how things change. We can't stop it, I guess, in many ways, but our Sundays need to be recognizing and worshiping God in some way, in an intentional way. Yes, sir, Dr. May.
I'd like to comment there. God hasn't changed. We have.
Okay. Yes.
What we do on Sunday probably doesn't please God as much as we think it does.
You know, we're used to the American culture. We all grew up here. And what if we grew up in a culture of the Muslims and we were the 1% Christian in that nation? You know, that'd be tough, wouldn't it? Yes.
And you see, that's we've studied not too many weeks ago where, when they entered a country, God gave them the message.
Yes.
Kill everything and everybody.
Yes. Yes.
Because He knew that those were distractions from His way of worship.
Yes.
And now that's our country now. We've got all of these, in 1792 when the Constitution was written, there was Presbyterians and a few, but they were all Judeo-Christian.
Yes. Yes.
Now they were fractured and were failed.
Yes. We got 2 or 3 minutes. Let me make a comment on that. Dr. May said, when the children of Israel went into the promised land God gave them, He said, clear everybody out. And whatever you do, you don't intermarry with the pagans around you, because they worship idols and they're going to corrupt you. They're going to corrupt you, so don't intermarry. That was their rule. Now, when you read on down through the history of all Israel, they had king after king. One time there'd be a good king and they'd worship the Lord. He'd die and his son would come along and he'd be an evil king, and they'd worship all these idols under the little groves that they planted and all that stuff. But if you ever read those books of history, it says, Ahaz died and his son Hezekiah became king when he was 25 years old, and his mother's name was this. Just about every king says he started ruling when he was 22 or whatever, 85 or whatever, but his mother's name was so-and-so. And we often think, well, why is the mother's name always given? Because these kings were so corrupt that they had multiple wives. God didn't like it at all, of course not. One man for one woman for life, that's the model. Yes. But for the hardest of their hearts, these kings had multiple wives, and a lot of them were pagan wives. And the way the mother raised the children is probably the way they worshiped. And it's very interesting that all these kings, their mother is listed first and foremost as their starting of their rule. Why? Because it showed, was this new king, young man coming on, middle-aged man, whatever, was he raised worshiping the true God or a false God? And so I want to end up by just saying, we as parents, we as grandparents, aunts and uncles, we've got to keep the story of God alive in our next generation. We've got to.